All right, so today we're diving into something that might seem kind of like a distant federal issue, but trust me, it could have a real impact right here in Colorado. We're asking the question, what happens to our schools if the U.S. Department of Education actually gets abolished?
Yeah, it's definitely a question a lot of folks are thinking about, especially with President-elect Trump. He made that campaign promise to get rid of the Department of Education. And it's got a lot of folks here in Colorado wondering what that could mean, particularly given, all the financial challenges our schools are already facing.
Exactly, and that's what we're going to be digging into today. This article from the Colorado Sun, published just a few days ago on November 26th, it really digs into, what's at stake for Colorado schools.
Yeah, the timing is really interesting right now. Colorado schools are already dealing with some pretty serious financial issues. So you throw in the possibility of losing federal support, and it just adds a whole other level of complexity.
Okay, so before we get into all the potential fallout, let's just step back for a second and clarify some things. When we talk about the Department of Education, what are we actually talking about? What do they do?
Right. There are a lot of misconceptions out there. Some people picture them as like this big, all-powerful entity that dictates, what gets taught in classrooms, but it's really not like that.
Yeah, I've heard that too. It always seems a little overblown to me.
Yeah, it is for sure. I think it's more helpful to think of them as kind of a support system.
Yeah.
They play a crucial role in three key areas: funding, oversight, and then higher education.
Okay, break those down for me.
Sure. So starting with funding, the Department of Education distributes a lot of grants to states. And a big chunk of that money is specifically targeted towards supporting vulnerable students. So, we're talking about kids in poverty, students with disabilities, and English language learners.
So if those federal funds were to disappear, those are the students who would feel the biggest impact.
Absolutely. And then you've got the oversight piece. The Department of Education really plays a big role in making sure that schools across the country are following civil rights laws, guaranteeing equal access to education for all students. They're kind of the watchdogs in that sense.
That makes sense. And what about higher education?
Well, you think about things like federal student loans and Pell Grants. Those are huge. Those programs are managed by the Department of Education, and they're lifelines for so many students who wouldn't be able to afford college otherwise. So getting rid of the department could have massive implications for college affordability.
It's starting to sound like this could reach way beyond just K-12 education then.
Yeah, for sure. And then on top of all of that, you have to think about the current financial situation for schools here in Colorado.
Yeah.
And it's not a pretty picture right now.
Yeah, the article definitely doesn't sugarcoat that. Declining enrollment, budget constraints,
Yeah.
we've got this promised state funding increase that's kind of still up in the air. And then there's this new school funding formula that everyone's trying to wrap their heads around. It's a lot.
It is. And then you throw on top of that the recent expiration of those federal COVID relief funds. That's forcing school districts to make some really tough choices, cutting programs or scrambling to find other ways to get funding.
So imagine adding the potential loss of even more federal funding on top of all of that. It's a little concerning, to say the least.
Yeah, it is. The article quotes Kevin Wellner. He's a director of the National Education Policy Center. And he basically said, that is going to result in a lot of chaos felt by people in state departments of education, the school districts, and in schools.
Yeah, chaos definitely comes to mind. Okay, so let's unpack some of these potential impacts a bit. The article mentions immediate chaos funding cuts and then this surge in political polarization, especially around the idea of school choice.
Right. So let's start with the chaos piece. Abolishing a major federal agency like the Department of Education, it doesn't just happen overnight. We'd be talking about this massive bureaucratic reshuffling responsibilities getting shifted probably to other departments that aren't really equipped to handle them. And there would be this period of, intense confusion and uncertainty for everybody.
And that uncertainty would trickle down to schools, right? I mean,
Yeah.
teachers, administrators, parents, students, everyone is going to be left wondering what happens next.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Imagine trying to plan a school year or hire
Yeah.
teachers or even just order supplies when you have no idea where the funding is coming from or what the rules are going to be.
Yeah.
It would be incredibly disruptive.
And then, of course, there's the whole issue of funding cuts. I know federal funding only makes up a small percentage of Colorado's education budget overall, something like 5% or even less.
Right, but it's targeted funding.
Exactly. And the article highlights that, pointing to Title I, which helps schools in low-income communities, and then IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Those are programs that could see some pretty big cuts, which would be, devastating for the students who need the most support.
Exactly. We're talking about potentially losing resources for things like after-school programs, special ed teachers, mental health support, even just basic supplies in some cases.
The article quotes Kevin Wellner again, and he brings up this really interesting point about similar situations in the past. He basically says that when the government tries to simplify things with these block grants, the money doesn't always actually end up where it's needed most.
Yeah, it's a classic case of, good intentions, but then the reality of how bureaucracy actually works. I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, here's this big chunk of money, but actually making sure it gets to the students who need it most, that's a whole other challenge.
It's kind of like throwing a dart at a dartboard blindfolded. You
Exactly.
might hit the target, but the odds aren't exactly in your favor.
That's a perfect analogy. And then to add even more complexity to the situation, the article predicts that education policy could get even more polarized under a Trump administration.
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. The article quotes Van Scholes. He's an education policy analyst. And he suggests that we could see this widening gap between, quote, blue states and red states,
Yeah.
unquote, in their approach to education.
Right, and with education becoming this kind of political battleground, we could see this surge in support for voucher programs, both at the state level and potentially even at the national level, which has been a longstanding goal for a lot of conservative policymakers.
So for our listener who maybe isn't super familiar with vouchers, can you just explain, like, how those work and why they're so controversial?
Sure. So basically, a voucher program would give parents public funds that they could then use to send their kids to private schools, including religious schools.
So instead of that money going to the public school system, it would follow the student to whichever school they choose.
Exactly, and that's where all the controversy comes in. People who support vouchers, they argue that it gives parents more control and it creates competition, which in theory could lead to improvements in both public and private schools.
hmm
But critics worry that it could actually end up making existing inequalities even worse.
Right. So you could have a situation where families who can already afford private school, they get these public funds to help cover the cost, while families who can't afford private school are stuck with public schools that are even more underfunded because of the money that's been diverted.
Exactly. And there are other concerns too, like accountability. Private schools often have less oversight than public schools. So there's a risk that, public funds could be used without the same level of transparency.
And what about the impact on teachers? Wouldn't this kind of major shift towards school choice affect them too?
Oh, absolutely. It could lead to a much more fragmented and less stable teaching workforce. Teachers in private schools often don't have the same job security or benefits as their public school counterparts. So it could make it harder to attract and keep good teachers, especially in areas that are already struggling with teacher shortages.
It sounds like we're talking about a potential domino effect here.
Yeah.
Funding cuts lead to instability, which drives teachers away, which then undermines the quality of education, and it just keeps going.
And it's important to remember that the impact wouldn't be felt equally across the board. It's likely that the schools and the students who are already struggling the most would be hit the hardest.
So we've got this potential perfect storm brewing, funding cuts, political battles, and this added pressure on schools that are already stretched thin. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, the article sums it up pretty well with another quote from Kevin Wellner. He says, the changes might be more difficult to recover from. I think that that's a source of anxiety.
Anxiety is putting it mildly.
Mhm.
So we've talked about the potential chaos, the funding cuts, the increased political fighting, and the added strain on schools that are already struggling to keep up. It's a lot to think about. And it might leave you wondering, why should I care about all of this? What does this have to do with me?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to feel disconnected from these like big policy debates, especially if you don't have kids in school right now. But the thing is, the quality of education in our communities, it impacts everybody, whether we realize it or not.
Oh, absolutely. A strong education system.
Yes.
It's like the foundation of a house.
Yeah.
If that foundation is shaky, the whole structure is at risk.
Okay, so let's break that down for our listener. How does something like, abolishing the Department of Education, this is happening all the way over in Washington, D.C., how does that actually impact someone's day-to-day life here in Colorado? Well, think about the economy for a second. A well-educated workforce is essential for, attracting businesses, driving innovation, creating jobs. And when businesses are thriving, everybody benefits. There's more tax revenue to support essential services, property values go up. There's just this general sense of prosperity.
So it's not just about kids in classrooms, then it's about creating this ripple effect of positive economic impact that reaches the whole community.
Exactly. And then you've got the social implications, too. Education is a powerful tool for social mobility. It empowers people to break cycles of poverty, achieve their dreams, and contribute to their communities.
It's about making sure everyone has the opportunity to succeed regardless of, their background or their circumstances.
Hmm.
And that kind of brings us back to this whole school choice debate and the potential rise of voucher programs. I can see how on the surface giving parents more options sounds like a good thing, but
But there's this real risk of unintended consequences. We have to ask ourselves, would a voucher program actually level the playing field, or would it just make existing inequalities even worse? Like if public funds are being diverted to private schools, especially those with selective admissions processes, what happens to the students who are left behind in the public schools?
yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Is it even possible to create a system of school choice that empowers parents without undermining the entire public education system? And how do we make sure that every student has access to quality education, regardless of where they live or their family's income?
These are tough questions, but they're important questions, and they're questions we need to be having as a society. We have to weigh the potential benefits of school choice against the potential risks, and we can't shy away from those tough conversations about, the trade-offs involved.
It's complex. There's no easy answers. But the stakes are high.
Uh,
This isn't just about some abstract policy debate. We're talking about the future of our kids, our communities, our country.
exactly, and that's why it's so important to stay informed, to stay engaged, and to make your voice heard. The decisions that we make about education today are going to have a lasting impact for generations to come.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with this one final thought to kind of chew on. What does a future look like to you where every child has the opportunity to reach their full potential? How can we work together to build an education system that is equitable, innovative, and truly serves the needs of all learners?
These are not easy questions, but they're the right questions. And remember, this deep dive was just the beginning. We hope you'll keep exploring these issues, keep the conversation going in your own community, and advocate for the kind of education system you believe in.
Because the future of education isn't something that just happens to us. It's something we build together.